Have you ever wondered what passive income looked like in medieval times? The concept of side hustles and passive income is something we talk a lot about today. But what we often fail to realize is this: the concept existed for centuries. You see, people in the past wanted to earn a bit of side income. They wanted a bit of extra money to make sure that they could look after their families well. When people think about the Middle Ages or medieval times, they think of ancient and unsophisticated people, but that's not entirely true. You see, everyone from the simple peasant to the high-ranking aristocrat were usually skilled at multiple trades, and they had to do this because life was quite uncertain back then. That's why we see evidence of a lot of alternate income strategies from that time. It's a trend that has continued till today. So what options were available to people in ancient times when it came to earning extra income? That's exactly what we want to explore in today's video. To keep things simple, we're going to look at 3 categories of people and explain how they earned extra income. And these 3 categories of people are the commoners, the middle class, and the aristocratic elites. So, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for these kinds of weekly videos about history and finance. Alright, let's get into it. Okay, let's start with the commoners. I'm referring to those who are at the very bottom of the social ladder, the humble folk who were the vast majority in ancient societies. These include peasants, serfs, and small-time landholders, and their life was rough, sometimes even brutal. However, compared to today, one thing that they had a bit more of is leisure or free time. Look, I don't mean restful time at the beach. I'm talking about unused time in a day where they weren't really doing much. It's not an enjoyable time off, not by any means, but rather they just had a lot more time on their hands compared to an average working person today. For example, if you look at this article, The Economist highlights that around the 14th century in Europe, it was a period of relatively higher wages. And the article goes on to saying, and I quote, peasants put in no more than 150 days in a year. So they had about half of the year free. They took advantage of this and they practiced trades aside from farming, and they found other areas in farming that they could improve on or make more money out of. And surprisingly, there were a lot of opportunities available. For instance, they could make a bit of money from extra activities like selling their craft items in the local village or even to traveling merchants. And in times when the season was good, they could afford to plant more than just good food crops. In medieval times in India, for instance, peasants would plant crops such as cotton, indigo, and sugarcane. And these were really smart folks because these kinds of crops earned a higher rate of income. Fun fact, these crops were actually such that people would have to pay in cash. That's where the term cash crops come from. Anyway, so all of these fetched quite high prices. This allowed for the commoners like farmers to live quite decently, even after paying out taxes or making payments to their landlords or other government bodies. Alright, so the next means of income for the commoners was quite off-putting, and that was slavery. You see, back then, even common people could have enslaved people. It's said that the average price of a slave was in the high 30s in ducats in medieval markets. Now, according to this Reddit user, 1 ducat is approximately $138 in today's money. So the price of, say, 38 ducats would be about $5,244. It's a significant investment, but not entirely out of reach for the free common man. Looking at historical data, an experienced laborer in medieval Europe could earn about £4. That, in today's value, is about 3,368 pounds, or just over 4,000 US dollars. Now, moreover, people also tended to live in large extended families. This meant that they often pooled their combined income. So affording enslaved people to work for you wasn't entirely out of the question. The enslaved folks would then be used to generate more income for their owners. This would happen by putting the slaves to work to generate more crops, to boost their income, and so on. Okay, next let's talk about the middle class of ancient societies. These folks would be composed of traders, brokers, craftsmen, untitled landholders, and high-ranking servants of royals. They usually earned enough to pay others for their work, and again, they even purchased enslaved people. However, the urban middle class was engaged in skilled professions, so getting talent to work for them would be very, very difficult because you couldn't just hire anyone and expect them to do the job. That would require years of skills to master. So the solution that they found was hiring an apprentice. This worked out quite well for both parties involved. You see, the apprentice would learn the trade and would benefit in the long run, and the master, in return, didn't have to pay the apprentice any wages until they got skilled enough. So, apprenticeship was one way to go, but in certain Islamic societies, slaves were actually preferred by craftsmen. This was due to the fact that the time, the money, and the effort that was spent behind training these slaves would be paid off by them simply not being able to leave for better opportunities. By the way, another fun fact, in Islamic societies, slaves weren't actually considered property, but human assets. That's why they could also hold property and take legal action if they were mistreated. That's why actually some slaves ended up ruling vast Islamic empires. Nevertheless, they were still subject to very harsh restrictions, which signified their lack of freedom. But in any case, the point is that these skilled professionals who were usually in the middle class and used folks like apprentices or slaves to boost their own productivity and output ended up earning more money. This isn't exactly passive income, but it was extra income for sure because of these practices. Another option for the middle class was trade ventures. These were the go-to opportunities for the middle class aspiring to increase their wealth. You see, people would pool together their wealth and fund merchant trade expeditions. Investors in these kinds of expeditions would usually put up the capital, and they would get back about 75% of the profits once they returned. So the investors normally got the lion's share of the profit when the merchants came back home. Okay, another one is a less risky alternative, which was to purchase goods from rural producers and sell them in town markets. An even less risky move was to simply ask the producer to pay a fixed amount to you. In return, any profit from the sales would go back to the producer. This arrangement worked out quite well for those who didn't have much capital to begin with. Okay, the next extra income idea actually worked out only if the middle class members had enough free time in their hand. They could use that time to volunteer for civil services. And what I mean here is basically engaging in corruption. So this is how it went down. Let's say that your lord in the area wanted some amount of money collected as taxes. You could then volunteer to be a tax collector for your lord. The tax collector basically helped to gather payment of taxes that were in excess of what was actually legally required. It was definitely a corrupt practice, but during these times there was very little oversight. These middle class folks who would basically work as tax collectors would collect a lot more taxes than was actually due, give the extra money to their lords, and probably get some kind of commission out of it. It's a pretty good, very immoral way to earn extra income. Alright, so next and last is the elites. Let's talk about the various elite members of society and how they went about increasing their wealth. For starters, their entire existence was based on passive income. Not side hustles, but true passive income where they earned money while they were sleeping. The elites had sway in vast agricultural domains on which others worked for their benefit. However, all of this was simply not enough. The elites employed various means to collect even more money to increase their wealth. They invested heavily in trade ventures that I mentioned earlier as well. For example, Henry the Navigator of Portugal was famous for financing daring trade expeditions through uncharted seas. His investments actually greatly helped pave the way for Europe's dominance in the later centuries. However, most elites were not so forward-thinking. Instead, they invested more energy in finding ways to milk more out of their commoners. You see, one method was licensing. Commoners would have to purchase a license or permit for the right to do various very simple things. For example, they would need a license to even get married, to move out of their village, to set up a stall, to even fortify their own residence, and so on. And then some elites also set up various tolls in their territory, charging money to any traveler or merchant passing through. Now let's say that one of the elites was short on cash, but they still had the high status. They could end up selling their nobility titles to the middle class and to the lower gentry. In places where the elites felt their position was secure, they were absolutely brutal, and they exploited these options to the fullest extent. As evident from history, people are resourceful, but they're also self-interested. Under ideal conditions, the quest for more money and less work can help drive progress. However, in reality, it can also lead to some terrible atrocities. And the genesis of all of this is the desire to earn more while doing less. And surprisingly, this has not changed much today. The concept of passive income and side hustles is as present today as it was back then. Since we're talking about passive income and side hustle ideas from the past, you might also be interested in learning how investments worked back in medieval times. I made a video about that right here, so check it out, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week.